Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So the reason why I put so much effort into researching and teaching the history of slavery and white supremacy is because that history is currently under attack by an organized conservative movement that is actively trying to make sure that Americans never know the real history of their country. For a long time, there has been an effort to whitewash and erase the history of slavery. And we can really see that if we look at American textbooks that have been used in middle schools and high schools. For decades, studies have shown that American textbooks routinely falsify, downplay, and distort the reality of slavery. For example, some textbooks were found to refer to enslaved people as workers or immigrants, and I think everybody can see why this is ridiculous and dangerous. Workers have agency. Workers can choose whether or not they go to work. Workers get paid for their labor. Immigrants have agency. They choose to go to another country. They are not kidnapped and then forced into enslavement. Some textbooks in Texas have been found to include extended discussions about how not all slaves were unhappy, about how some enslaved people actually enjoyed their enslavement. This racist trope of the happy slave can be seen in children's books like this, A Birthday Cake for George Washington, which features enslaved people on the cover who are smiling and happy and completely content with their life. And luckily, this book was pulled from the shelves. But can you imagine the damage this would do to a young child that's just learning how to read, and this is the image they're getting of slavery, the first image they're getting, this image of the happy slave? Anytime there's been a push to talk about slavery more in the classroom or teach a more accurate history of slavery, there is always pushback from Republicans. For example, in 2019, the New York Times released the 1619 Project, and one of the fundamental goals of that project was to get students in American classrooms to be talking about slavery more and to have a more accurate understanding of this history. And as soon as American teachers started bringing the 1619 Project into the classroom, Republican lawmakers across the country started issuing bills to ban the teaching of 1619. They even went as far as to try to deny funding to any schools that taught the 1619 Project. Now, even though there are some issues with some of the topics that are discussed in the essays and articles associated with the 1619 Project, I still fundamentally believe in the main mission of the project. We need to be talking about slavery more, especially to our students, and we need to be having a more accurate discussion about the reality of what slavery really was. And the reason we need to be having that conversation is because this history is always under attack. For example, after the 1619 Project got started in 2019, in 2020, President Trump started his own 1776 Commission. The 1776 Commission was designed as a complete overhaul of how American history is taught in public schools. And when Trump announced the 1776 Commission, he said that this was going to be patriotic, pro-America education. He said that the 1776 Commission will be a pro-American curriculum that will encourage educators to teach our children about the miracle of American history and show them that America is the most fair, equal, and prosperous nation in human history. The 1776 Commission was going to introduce students to slavery, but they were going to downplay it. It wasn't going to be part of the main narrative. They were also going to get rid of mentioning anything about the violence that was committed by European and American colonists against indigenous peoples. Even though when Biden won the presidency, one of the first things he did was issue an executive order to cancel the 1776 Commission, there are still states across the country that are trying to implement exactly what Trump was going for, a pro-America patriotic education that completely distorts, downplays, and erases the reality of slavery. In Tennessee, conservative lawmakers have gone after the history of slavery by attacking critical race theory, which is essentially just critically analyzing how race has shaped American history, not so much of a theory as much as a fact. In Texas and Oklahoma, Republican lawmakers have also issued bills and laws attacking the teaching of history and trying to downplay the reality and the brutality of this system. Florida has been at the forefront of this effort to distort and erase the real history of slavery. They've tried teaching that there were actually positive benefits to slavery. And they've also tried to get rid of any discussion of slavery that would make any white students in the classroom uncomfortable. But here's the thing, history shouldn't be comfortable. We should feel uncomfortable when confronted with this history of slavery and white supremacy. History should not be easy. History is hard. History is not about confirming what you think or making yourself feel better. History is about being open to learning and discovering new information and even challenging everything that you thought you knew. I agree with historian Hassan Kwame Jeffries, who said, "Slavery is hard history. It's hard to comprehend the inhumanity that defined it. It is hard to discuss the violence that sustained it. It is hard to teach the ideology of white supremacy that justified it. And it is hard to learn about those who abided it. We, the people, have a deep-seated aversion to hard history because we are uncomfortable with the implications it raises about the past as well as the present." Conservatives don't want us to know the true history of slavery because once you start engaging with this material, you can never look at American history the same ever again. And more importantly, once you start learning this real history, you start making connections between the past and the present, and we start seeing the way that white supremacy and slavery still shapes and impacts the world that we live in today. Conservatives are trying to erase the real history of slavery to create and control a new narrative, and we know what that narrative is. Slavery wasn't that bad. Not all enslaved people were unhappy. You know what? It wasn't even really slavery. Enslaved people were really workers. They were immigrants. That's the narrative that they want to promote, and it's a lie. That's why it is the responsibility of all history teachers and professors to research and learn the real history of slavery and white supremacy. It's hard history, but good history is never easy. Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So the other day I posted a video talking about the very important topic of the lynching of Black Americans by white mobs in this country in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I wanted to make another video going into the origin of the word lynching and talking about the definition and statistics. If you've ever been driving down the highway in Virginia and you've seen Lynchburg, that is the Lynch family, and it is one of those family members, Charles Lynch, where we get the word lynching from. Charles Lynch was a slave owner in Virginia, and during the American Revolution, he created his own local militia. And what they would do is they would go out and look for British loyalists or Tories that were still loyal to the British king, and they would attack, assault, and punish these individuals, most often by tying them to a tree and having them whipped. So this was basically mob violence. There was no jury, no judge, no trial, no law. This was just Charles Lynch and his gang going out and finding these loyalists and violently assaulting them, sometimes even hanging them. So word started to spread about Charles Lynch and his method of treating loyalists, and people started saying things like lynch law and calling him Judge Lynch. So the word lynching did not originally begin as a term to describe racist violence. It began in the context of the American Revolution. Now, fast forward to the 1800s. When slavery ended in the 1860s, white Americans started terrorizing and murdering Black Americans to show them that even though they were no longer enslaved, they would never really be true Americans. They could never feel safe and comfortable in this country. And as these illegal mob killings of Black Americans spread, people started resurrecting that word lynch law and Judge Lynch, and eventually that got shortened to lynchings. So when we use this word lynching, what we are describing is racial terrorism. And if we look at the statistics, that is exactly what we see. From 1865 to 1965, 6,500 to 10,000 Black Americans were lynched. And even though other racial groups were targeted and killed, such as Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, Italian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, even though these individuals were also lynched, if we look at the numbers, 72% of all recorded lynchings were Black Americans, even though they only represented 12% of the US population. So this was racial terrorism targeted against Black Americans. 72% of all lynchings were targeted at the Black community. In places like Georgia, 95% of all recorded lynchings were against Black Americans. These numbers are really important, and it's important to be accurate when we're talking about lynching, because we can still see people making a false both sides equivalency. For example, in 2019, Republican Colorado State Representative Lori Sain made this incorrect statement. She said, "We have come a long way since the Reconstruction days, since whites and blacks alike were in nearly equal numbers lynched for the crime of being Republican." That is absolutely incorrect. White Americans and Black Americans were in no way, shape, or form lynched at equal levels. Lynching was racial terrorism directed against the Black community by white Americans. So this word is very specific, and it's important to have an accurate understanding of what it means. It's also important to recognize that lynching was a constant feature across American history for over 100 years. From 1883 to 1922, there were no less than 50 lynchings of Black Americans every year. In the 1890s, every single year of that decade, there was over 100 lynchings of Black Americans, with the worst year being 1892, that saw 161 killings. It took until 1936 for the lynching of Black Americans to get under 10 a year. And this is probably the most important piece of data connected to lynchings. 99% of the lynchers were never charged with a crime. So this was killing without consequence. This was American terrorism. This is why it infuriates me when I hear the word lynching being used in a metaphorical context or an analogy. People talking about political lynchings, such as Donald Trump comparing his impeachment to a lynching. And Joe Biden has done the same thing. He's also used words like political lynching. As we've seen, lynching is a word with a very specific meaning. It is racial terrorism that was directed against the Black community by white Americans. And it's something that is not talked about enough, and we need to talk about more. Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So the other day I was watching the video of conservative commentator Charlie Kirk debating 25 liberal college students, and one scene in particular really stood out to me. So in the scene, a student is discussing the racist violence that Black Americans faced for over a century in this country, and she points out how from the 1860s until the 1960s, 4,000 Black men, women, and children were lynched. Now, I think that it is so important that she's bringing lynching into the conversation, because it is a critical topic to focus on if you really want to know the true history of the United States. However, the number of African Americans that were lynched in this country is far greater than 4,000. For many years, the best data that we had on lynching came from the Equal Justice Initiative. And in 2015, they released a study that found evidence for 4,400 lynchings of African Americans. However, in 2020, the Equal Justice Initiative released a new report that found evidence of an additional 2,000 lynchings, bringing the current number up to 6,500 lynchings of African Americans in this country. But even the number of 6,500 lynchings is probably still too low. And I guarantee that as more research is done, that number is going to continue to rise. And it's probably going to get closer to the estimate given by anti lynching activist Ida B. Wells, who said that there was probably 10,000 lynchings of African Americans that occurred. However, even 10,000 might be a low estimate when we add in the number of African Americans that were killed in what were described as race riots. You might be familiar with the 1921 Tulsa massacre, in which hundreds of African Americans were killed by their white neighbors in Oklahoma. When I was doing research on lynching, I came across thousands of accounts of lynchings in historical newspaper databases. But another thing that I came across over and over again were these accounts of massacres that were the killing of not just individuals, but dozens and even hundreds of African Americans. Here's an example of a headline that I came across from 1873, which reads, "The War of Races. Nearly 300 Negroes burned to death by whites in Louisiana. A horrible affair." Now, can you imagine how much that number of 6,500 or 10,000 would grow if we add in all of these episodes of race riots and massacres that killed hundreds of people across the country? We'll probably never know the true number of African Americans that were killed through lynching or white supremacist violence because so many of these stories have left no trace at all in the historical record. For example, in Margaret Burnham's recent book by hands now known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners, she begins by telling the story of Ollie Hunter. Ollie Hunter was a black woman in her 60s that was living in Georgia. And in 1944, she went to a general store. And while she was in the store, she picked up a can of oil. The white male owner of the store screamed at her to put down the can of oil, which she did, and then she walked out of the door. As she left the store, the owner came up behind her and brutally beat her to death with an axe. Now, in the book, Burnham notes that we would have never known about this murder if it wasn't for a single letter that an individual sent to the NAACP complaining about how the man who committed this murder was never charged with the crime. And it wasn't until 2020 when researchers finally recovered the name of Ollie Hunter and brought her story back into the light. Can you imagine how many more Ollie Hunters are out there? How many more stories of white supremacist violence that are untold and waiting to come into the light? That's why I always say the true number of lynchings will never be known. But even if we ever did come to an accurate number of how many African Americans were lynched in this country, that number will never be able to reflect the reality and the horror of living in a society that allowed this type of violence to happen.